Welcome to, I suppose, this lunchtime webinar called Meal Planning for Weight Loss, Simple, Fast, and Affordable. And since we are noon right on the dot, I'll make sure to get this started. But of course, if you're coming back, welcome again to this presentation. If you're new here, just know that I do offer time for people to ask questions. And so at the bottom left hand of your screen, there should be a Q&A button. Please feel free to press that. You can elect to be anonymous or leave your name. Just if you do have your name out, I will most likely say it so you know I'm addressing your question. And let's get started, okay? Meal planning for weight loss, simple, fast, and affordable. And as I do with every weekly presentation, I always like to remind everyone it is the quality of your calories that matters. Since we're doing fewer calories generally, we want to make sure that the quality is one of our top priorities so that you can achieve not only potentially weight loss goals, but also your health goals. So we want to maintain that health regardless. So what we're going to cover today are some basics of meal planning, as well as a few grocery shopping tips for affordability and what to keep on hand in your kitchen. I'll give a few meal prep ideas, or at least how to get started in the meal prepping process. I also want to encourage everyone to avoid overwhelming oneself. The idea of creating a week-long or a month-long meal plan can sound very exciting, but it can also be very overwhelming when we first start out. I certainly know that I'm not making month-long meal plans, and this is my job. So just be aware of your limitations and don't feel like you need to summit the tallest mountain to start out with, so to speak. And again, at the very end of the presentation today, I will leave time for your questions to ask here, or if you wish to ask later, if you would rather have me answer your question offline. So let's talk about the basics of meal planning. So first and foremost, we want to remember the priorities. And what I mean by remembering the priorities is that lean protein should be at least 25% of your plate. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily use a plate. You can see this image I have here is more or less a bowl. But if you can know that a quarter of that's going to be taken up by lean protein of some sort, and then 50% of your bowl or plate or whatever you're consuming is non-starchy vegetables, if that's in the form of a salad, or if that's in the form of some roasted broccoli and cauliflower, or I suppose even an artichoke, then those would be some things to have on that 50% of your plate. Then now we have that little quarter left where we want to encourage to not necessarily get rid of carbohydrates, but aim for the higher fiber complex carbohydrates. That's where we're talking about the whole grains, whole wheat, or perhaps if you're doing fruit, berries, which have a lot of fiber. And so that's where we would want to save 25% of our plate. And of course, we want to include fat because fat equals flavor, but it also equals important nutrition to keep in mind. So cooking with healthy fats is also very, very important. And what I mean by healthy fats, I'm sure you're aware, but I'm a big proponent of olive oil and also avocado oil if we're looking at higher heat cooking. The next part of the basics, which I touched on a little bit in the very intro, is don't overplan. Every day doesn't have to be different, right? Most people eat about the same breakfast every morning. That isn't everybody, but most people have sort of a pattern. And that's okay. You don't have to think as though you are creating a 3 Michelin star 4-course meal every single day. So don't worry about being too high in variety. Leftovers, repeat meals, that's okay as long as we're focusing on the priorities of the protein and non-starchy vegetables, right? And also try and come up with theme days, or maybe you can think of 3 to 4 different options for meals. So if you had Taco Tuesday, then tacos every Tuesday, that takes care of one of your days. So you don't have to think about what am I going to have for Tuesday dinner and then maybe Wednesday lunch. You just know that it is going to be taco themed, and then we can find a recipe to work off of that. So that can also be where we approach from so that we don't have to try and overthink every single day. And what I mean by the 3 to 4 different options for meals kind of involves that here are some meals I enjoy. I had this last night. I wouldn't mind having that again. And starting to collect that. So start with some favorite recipes of yours and start to put that in your weekly rotation. And then you'll know that you can sort of expect a certain type of food every week, every other week, maybe every couple of days, depending on what we're looking at. Looking in grocery shopping tips, there are some smart strategies here as well, and maybe you're already aware of them. Some basic smart strategies, of course, is to focus on the perimeter of the grocery stores. Just about every grocery store is put together in a very similar fashion, where the perimeter is going to have your fresh and usually less processed foods, the vegetables, the produce, the meats, the dairy, all around. There are some exceptions to this rule, but that is where you have that. And also, before you go grocery shopping, if you have some meal ideas, make a list based on that meal plan. You want to go in with a list and be prepared so that there's not as many impulse buys, especially if maybe perhaps you're hungry. Also, remember that frozen fruits and vegetables can be just as or more nutritious than fresh fruits and vegetables. The reason for this is not necessarily if you're looking at fruits and vegetables that are mixed in with a bunch of different sauces, or I've seen vegetables where it's this cheesy sauce or something like that. That's not really what I'm talking about, but just the plain fruit or veggie. And what happens is when those are flash frozen, they are picked right when they're ripe. They're not picked early to ripen, or they're not picked at ripeness and then sitting on a shelf somewhere, losing the nutritional value. They're frozen, it's locked in. So don't discount those, because they can also be a real money saver, space saver as well, and less likely to turn into food waste because you don't have to worry about them going bad in the fridge. Also, dried lentils. In terms of dried beans, which we know can store pretty well, last a while, and are very nutrition powerhouse, lentils cook faster than any other type of a dried bean. So if you are looking to cook something with beans quickly, lentils can sometimes be a welcome respite if you're not doing canned beans, which that is in my next little section here, because some nutrient dense and generally affordable staples does include canned beans. If you rinse beans, generally you're going to get that sodium off that you might be looking to remove. So that's okay to use canned beans, in those instances. But dried is also fine, just kind of depends on the space you have. Oats are always good to have on hand, and Greek yogurt. And we all know that store brands can be a better deal, generally. If you don't notice a difference in the quality, if you don't notice a difference in the texture, feel free to go with the store brand. There are certain foods, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there are certain foods where I don't prefer the store brand, but there are others where I really can't tell the difference. So go with what works for you and what works for your pocketbook. And then finally, the cost comparison. So this may be something you already know, but I know I didn't learn this until probably college in one of my classes, and it blew my mind. So it's very interesting how these things can be learned. So I want to make sure to share with you that when you are looking at food items in the shelves or what have you, there is not just the retail price. You can see in this example with ketchup on the left here, which was from, I believe, the Illinois extension that had this example here. And so they're comparing the 13-ounce ketchup bottle to a 44-ounce ketchup bottle, and you can see that the 44-ounce ketchup bottle, the whole price is definitely more expensive than the retail, as you can clearly see. So most people would think, oh, the 13 ounce is going to be the cheaper option. And for some people in a certain moment, that may be their better choice just because of the resources they might have on hand. But if we want to look at true money saving in the long term, if you have the ability to purchase this higher priced item, you can see that there's a difference in unit price. So what is the cost of this ketchup per ounce? And if we're taking that into account, we can see that the 44-ounce ketchup is actually 13.6 cents per ounce versus the 16.7 cents per ounce in the 13-ounce bottle. All in all, the 44-ounce ketchup bottle ends up being a better deal. And you can also use this with sale items because sometimes sale items will seem very flashy, but always look at that unit price if you want to find the best possible deal. Something else that can help with meal planning and just being ready is to keep some staples on hand. So pantry staples, I'd give a very quick list here, but canned or jarred tomatoes, depending on what you would like there. You can start making sauces with that. Quinoa is a really good dried grain, and if you've listened to some of my other presentations, you know that quinoa is also a complete protein. Dried and canned beans, which we mentioned earlier, some low sodium broths, as well as seasonings and herbs to add flavor. For the fridge and freezer, these can be a bit interchangeable, but having some fruits and veggies in your freezer, as well as cooked grains. So if you make some rice ahead of time and you cool it and you put it in the freezer, that keeps it safe and can also help build up some resistant starches, making that a bit healthier. You can also keep bread in the freezer, which will make it last longer. And pre-cooked meats or any bulk meat purchases you can keep in the freezer for a decent amount of time. There is a certain point at which they will go bad with some freezer burn, but you definitely get a bit of a longer life, clearly, if you're going to have those in the freezer. For the refrigerator, eggs, yogurt, cottage cheese, hummus, those are some very good high protein items, generally easy to prepare if they're not already ready right there. And then fresh leafy greens to prepare maybe some salads, or if they're vegetable crudités, you can use them to eat with the hummus. Also, you might have those staples, and so you can have a checklist that include those staples. So there are some pre-made ones out there, or maybe you've put together an Excel sheet or some list of foods that you want to have on hand at all times. And then you can check what you have or what you might need before grocery shopping. And I have this little star here for example, because I'm going to share an example really quickly, which I'd be happy to send to anyone that wants it. Just get in touch with the Premier Weight Loss staff. I'll be happy to share it. So let's make sure that it popped up. Okay, here we go. So this is actually a DLP kitchen grocery list. So you don't have to follow this to the letter, but it gives you examples from each category of foods that you might want to have on hand, things that can be easily used. And they talk about different fishes, meats, some commonly used spices and herbs, condiments, of course. And they also, since this is considered to be geared toward people on GLP-1 medications, they do touch on protein powders and protein shakes because that may be important. We also move down into the oils and vinegars, broths, and then some frozen foods, which actually they touch on a few things here, which I like. I don't know if you've seen them in the grocery store, but some companies have started making frozen blocks of garlic or ginger cubes so that you have these very easy to use blocks to pop into maybe a soup or whatever you're cooking, so you don't have to go through the labor-intensive process of cutting garlic or cutting ginger. They also talk about the dried lentils cooking faster and looking for protein powders and shakes that are low in added sugars and have at least 20 grams of protein per serving if possible. So if you want this list, I do have that available, but this can give you also an example of what you might want to use for yourself. Going back, Let's make sure. Okay. And then at the very end here, I do list out that it's important to know, because many people think buying in bulk, even with the example where I showed that the bigger ketchup bottle was less expensive, there's also other ways of buying in bulk, Costco, Sam's Club, those types of grocery stores often have bulk items. And while that does lead to cost savings, really that's only helpful if one, you have the space in your house to store it, and two, if you can use up that total quantity in time. Otherwise, there's just going to be food wasted and probably not as much money saved as it initially may seem. So just be aware of that. Now let's talk about meal prepping. So a lot of times when people talk about meal prepping, there was that, I don't want to call it a fad because it was very helpful and useful, and I do believe people do this, but people will sometimes prep for an entire week. They'll take Sunday afternoon and prep everything, chop, freeze, cook, and have it ready to go for the week. And that's great. I have no complaints, no notes, and sometimes that might be a relaxing way to spend an afternoon. But there are other people who may just find that batch cooking for a whole week is just tedious. There's too much to prepare, or maybe there's not enough space in the freezer. So be flexible with yourself. Maybe if you make a meal that you really enjoy, double the recipe. So just double the ingredients. If something calls for 1 cup of, say, chopped onions, you'll want to increase it to 2 cups of chopped onions, which is quite a bit of chopped onions, but you get the point there. So double up your portions, and you can freeze half of that for leftovers or have that ready to go in some manner. Sometimes that's a little easier than trying to cook multiple different recipes and rather than say just doubling one recipe. Some people find that a bit easier to go. Also, you can cook in 2 or 3 day blocks because some people just don't like the taste of frozen and reheated food, and that's fair. There are some things that don't reheat very well, and so maybe you would feel more comfortable cooking 2 or 3 days ahead of time, having that stored in the fridge, and so that might be a little bit more fresh tasting and easier overall. So that's okay. You can be flexible with those options and what works with your life. But also for meal prepping, one of the top things for everyone is we want to save time. And so something that maybe not as inexpensive as a whole vegetable, I would have to compare it, but there are pre-chopped vegetables that are already frozen. And I've even seen packages where it's, for an example, because I happen to have it in my own freezer, Kroger has a fajita blend of vegetables that are already pre-chopped. So that's, I believe, red and yellow peppers and onion. And peppers, while they're not the hardest thing to cut, is a bit of a tedious process too, just to deal with all the seeds, the stem, all of that. So this is a package of all these vegetables ready to go, and you can just open and dump it in your pan if you're making fajitas or something that calls for those types of vegetables. You don't have to mess with it, and it's ready to go, and it is pretty inexpensive. So that's a very big time saver. Also, if you are going to make something with grains, say that quinoa, or if you're going to be making a bunch of chicken dishes, maybe there's a casserole coming up, something like that, you can definitely make those proteins in larger amounts and freeze them in, say, individual containers. So those can be ready to use when you're making your next item that contains that. And then bowls and salads, the nice thing, especially about bowls, is almost a clean out your fridge kind of meal, because a grain bowl can use any sort of leftover that sounds good if you want to add it to that bowl. And salads are also able to use, say, maybe some extra chicken that you grilled, put that on top. So those are really handy to use some of your leftovers, and bowls and salads also turn into decent leftovers. The lettuce, maybe not so much unless you enjoy wilted salads, which do exist, but not everybody's so into that, but those can also turn into good leftovers, and they're easy to pack, and you can have those for lunch. Also, we've sort of touched on this, but prep within reality. And what I mean is be honest and real with yourself about what works for you. So I talked earlier already saying maybe you look at this empty week here, this meal planner week, and it just seems overwhelming. You're thinking, today's Sunday. I don't even know what I'm doing on Thursday. Maybe there's a birthday party coming up. I don't want to plan something and buy when I don't even know what the rest of my week's going to look like. That's okay. Start by planning 1 or 2 days at a time. Maybe don't even plan for a specific day, but just say to yourself, this week, I want to make 2 of my favorite dinners. And I can make extra if I want to have some leftovers for lunch, if that's something you enjoy. So whether or not you decide that it's going to be a Tuesday and Thursday that you're making your meal, just say to yourself, this week I'm going to buy for these 2 types of meals. And then when you know that you're not going to be going anywhere or when you have the time, you'll be ready to go. Also, use tools that work for you. There are some apps out there that can be very handy for meal planning and also grocery list writing, which I think is really nice. I will say I am not a big app user, but there are some that have good reviews, and I wanted to mention them. So these do come at an additional cost. I think a couple of them are somewhere around the $5 range. So also work with what works for you. Paprika, I see, gets very good reviews. It's mostly a grocery builder. It also is a recipe keeper, if you will. Meal Lime, I don't know as much about, and it is called Meal Lime. I had to double check the spelling on that one. It does do some menu planning, and I do know that it seems like the pro version, so the paid version, is a bit easier to work with. And then also Chronometer, which I haven't used to see how it works, but that also received good reviews. I have used Eat Love, and this one actually also develops meal plans for people who are on GLP medications. So I wanted to at least mention a few that I've either experienced myself or I know of people who have used them and feel very positively about them. So those may be worth investigating. Or if you're like me, because I'm not a big app person, that's just my personality, but the old-fashioned way. So use a printable template to write on. Use Excel. There are so many versions of templates. I had gotten this one and I pasted it here. You can do this type of pattern where you've got your day of the week, main dish, shopping list, etc., etc. And I know some people even have a magnetized version that they keep on their fridge, and so it's ready to go. So use what works for you. And again, you don't have to fill it out in one go. If you just want to write down 2 days worth, that's okay. You've got 2 days out of the way, and 2 probably healthy days when we're planning like this. And also remind yourself, and this is a be kind to yourself, you don't have to be a chef every night. There are some nights where a convenience food or maybe the frozen GLP-1 meals that I've discussed before, there are a couple that are made now. Those are okay to have. Dining out occasionally is also okay. In fact, I wouldn't expect you not to, because many people want to go out and socialize, might want to not think about cooking. Maybe they don't want to do dishes, and that's okay. So I want to make sure that as long as the majority of your dietary pattern is approached from a mindful and healthy perspective, having a couple days of fun is okay and won't throw you off the game. So to put this together, meal planning can definitely seem daunting at first, but it can become simple with practice. And again, once you've got a few meals under your belt, then you know those can be repeats. So finding new ideas might not be as important as time goes on because you already have those locked and ready to go. Remember your priority of focusing on balanced macronutrients, your protein, your carbs, your healthy fats. If you keep those priorities in focus, that's always going to be beneficial. Be sure to keep some budget-friendly staples on hand, just for your own benefit, to avoid headaches of, we ran out of this and now I can't make this whole meal that I was expecting to make. And then save time with some strategies that work for you. So is it pre-cooked and frozen? Is it pre-cut and frozen? Do you enjoy doing the batch cooking and having batch things frozen or refrigerated and labeled and ready to use? Do what works best for you. And start with a few reliable recipes to start out with, and don't be afraid of that repetition. As long as we're not repeating an unhealthy food, then having something that you enjoy and you can expect and eventually be able to probably make without ever having to read the recipe, it'll just make things easier as it goes along. And so now I leave it open for any questions. It's not yet 12:30, so I will be silent here and wait for a couple of minutes. And if you have any questions that come to mind, feel free to hit that Q&A at the bottom of the screen and to type in your question. You can be anonymous or have your name, or if there's anything that we talked about that you would like a copy of, like the list or anything else, feel free to reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff. They can get in touch with me and I will be happy to answer any questions offline or send any materials that you would like to have available to you. All right, I will be waiting for any questions. Okay, wait a minute. I don't want to hold anyone up for their lunch, so I hope that this was an informative, helpful meeting, and I hope that there was a little bit of new information that everyone had a chance to learn at some point. But I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Take care, stay dry if it's raining in your area, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.